Okay, well, it looks like the abundance book isn't going away as quickly as I had hoped that it might. If you haven't seen it, this is a book by Ezra Klein of the New York Times and Derek Thompson of The Atlantic. It has spent months now on the New York Times nonfiction bestseller list. David Brooks calls it spectacular. Fareed Zakaria calls it terrific. Ezra Klein was recently a special guest at a retreat for Democratic senators, and the Wall Street Journal reports that Democratic politicians are rushing to embrace the new mantra of abundance laid out in the book. And in fact, not one but two congressional caucuses have recently formed to push legislation advancing the ideas laid out in the book. And politics nerds around the country are even starting abundance clubs. So what is abundance exactly? The book's promotional copy touts it as a once-in-a-generation paradigm-shifting call to renew a politics of plenty, face up to the failures of liberal governance, and abandon the chosen scarcities that have deformed American life. Now, the book is a kind of manifesto, the gist of which is that we could live in a wondrous utopia if we removed bottlenecks that are stifling innovation and the production of plenty. Now, I think I'm only being slightly hyperbolic there, because the book really does begin with a description of a literal wondrous utopia in which there are no pandemics, no homelessness, and no financial crises. In this fabulous future, factories in space produce miracle drugs, the work week is brief, and all the cars are electric. And Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson say that for years, human beings simply didn't build this utopia because we constrained our ability to solve our most important problems. And then they spend the rest of the pages of the book kind of laying out a series of constraints, like zoning rules, grant paperwork for the National Institutes of Health, environmental impact reviews, racial equity requirements for government contractors, progressive lobbying groups, all these kind of impediments which supposedly keep us from getting to this glorious, sparkling tomorrow that we could have. Now, as I've described it there, abundance might sound like it's a rehash of the standard right-wing narrative in American politics. Government regulation gets in the way of innovation, and environmental groups hurt the very cause they're trying to help. So we must slash the bureaucracy, roll back the regulations, and let the invisible hand of the free market work its magic. But Klein and Thompson are actually saying something a little different from that. They do believe in government. They're not exponents of laissez-faire capitalism. They say the state is no enemy of invention or innovation. In fact, one of their arguments is that right-wingers are wrong to conclude that government inefficiencies are inevitable. They are highly critical of the view that markets should be left to solve problems on their own, and they cite examples like Operation Warp Speed that made the COVID vaccine, and the governor of Pennsylvania, Josh Shapiro's rebuilding of the collapsed I-95 bridge. And they give these as examples of government working, and they use them to show that we need state-directed solutions to some of our biggest problems. Now, Ezra Klein himself has professed himself frustrated that he's perceived as a neoliberal, or a neo-neoliberal, as one reviewer said, because Klein says this is a book about the state being more, not less powerful, and being more capable of doing big things. And that's actually true. It would be wrong to classify abundance as classically neoliberal in the sense that it's pro-free market and pro-small state. Some of its arguments are actually compatible with left-wing politics. Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson even favorably quote Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels' Communist Manifesto and Aaron Bastani's fully automated luxury communism, which kind of alarmed the Wall Street Journal's reviewer of the book. And yet, as a manifesto for a new kind of democratic politics, the Democratic politicians should embrace the abundance framework is a disaster. It should be rejected. Democrats do not need abundance clubs. What they need is a social democratic populist agenda that echoes Franklin Delano Roosevelt and Bernie Sanders. Unfortunately, the donor class is horrified by this kind of politics, and centrist Democrats are desperate for an alternative to it, which is why they are flocking to the abundance agenda. It offers them the possibility of appearing to stand for something without standing for anything that will radically challenge the economic status quo. Now look, some of what's in abundance is both true and important. Klein and Thompson argue that California should have been able to build high-speed rail faster and more cheaply than it has, and indeed the project was an infamous boondoggle. They also argue that blue state governments have not delivered for people, and there's no argument here. Current Affairs magazine is consistently critical of the failures of the Democratic Party to govern well, and Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson are right that progressives should be willing to recognize when red tape and bureaucracy are getting in the way of government efficiency. And they argue that instead of measuring success by how much money we spend on a program, like saying, oh, we've allocated $1 billion to climate initiatives and so forth, we need to pay more attention to whether the program that we're funding actually accomplishes its objectives. So the problem with Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson's abundance is that it's doing more than making this kind of argument that the government should be effective at achieving its goals. It's also offering itself as a fully comprehensive agenda that the Democrats should reorient themselves around. In fact, Klein and Thompson sometimes appear to believe they've found a panacea, a cure for everything. Thompson's original essay in The Atlantic outlining the abundance agenda carried the unfathomably arrogant headline, "A Simple Plan to Solve All of America's Problems." Now, you might think that was just a little bit of cheeky overstatement on his part, but the whole argument of his essay is that while it may look like America has many problems, expensive healthcare and housing, bad public transit, a climate crisis, these are in fact manifestations of the same problem, which is the failure to build enough. So one reason leftists are frustrated with this book is that Klein and Thompson don't stick to the narrow point that regulations impeding the construction of high-speed rail, for instance, or the deployment of electric vehicle charging stations need to be rewritten. They also purport to offer, as the jacket copy states, some kind of paradigm-shifting rewrite of the entire political playbook, and that's where we need to be suspicious. Consider two possible arguments. Argument number one, regulations are preventing government from achieving important objectives. Democrats should identify bottlenecks that inhibit housing construction, clean energy infrastructure, and medical breakthroughs, and work to eliminate those obstacles. Red tape is an issue. Argument number two, the core story of our time is the story of regulatory failures that inhibit construction and innovation. Our political agenda should be built around eliminating these failures at its core. And if we do this, we will live in a utopia. Red tape is the central issue of the era. Now, those two arguments are not the same. And one of the frustrating things about abundance is that it appears to be making both of them. Then, when leftists criticize argument number two, Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson retreat to argument number one. What, do you think regulatory bottlenecks are good? Now, that kind of argumentative structure is often called a Mott and Bailey argument, in which an extreme indefensible claim is coupled with a mild defensible claim, and when you go after the indefensible claim, they retreat to the defensible claim. Sometimes abundance seems to be making the very modest claim that government should work well, and sometimes it appears to be making the very grandiose claim that an abundance versus scarcity paradigm should be applied to all of America's problems. As Luke Savage writes, it offers us a series of discrete ideas related to the likes of zoning policy and high-speed rail, but also presents itself as an epochal political manifesto sketching the outlines for an entirely new kind of liberalism. And I, like Luke Savage, have a little problem with number one, but a very big problem with number two, because it means ditching social democracy as the centerpiece of the progressive agenda. I agree with Matt Brunig, who wrote in a criticism of the book that it would be a huge mistake on the merits to sideline whatever focus there is on welfare state expansion and economic egalitarianism in favor of a focus on administrative burdens in construction. And make no mistake, that is what Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson are doing here. They insist that their agenda is not incompatible with social democracy and wealth redistribution, but it's clearly a different set of priorities. They say that for years, American liberalism has measured its success in how near it could come to the social welfare system of Denmark, but now we need something different. Now, Brunig points out that this is in fact ludicrously false, since American liberalism has not pursued Nordic social democracy, but let's leave that aside for now. Bernie Sanders-style politics is built around higher wages, single-payer healthcare, paid family leave, free college, a humane immigration system, and a Green New Deal. Abundance liberalism, Klein and Thompson say, is a new set of questions around which our politics should revolve, like what is scarce that should be abundant, and what inventions do we need that we do not yet have? Now, abundance purports to tell a comprehensive story. The story of America in the 21st century, they write, is the story of chosen scarcities. Not, in other words, a story of wealth concentration, plutocracy, and the war on workers. Now, Ezra Klein has admitted that his theory of power is one that is anathema to the left because it says, essentially, there is no class struggle between owners and workers. Sometimes, Ezra Klein says, unions are the problem, and sometimes corporations are the problem, and the abundance liberal just cares about what works. He rejects the view of politics as a, quote, morality play, and that's probably why the language of justice, rights, and equality vanish from the abundance framework. And that might explain why abundance has been embraced by the right-wing Democrats who hate Bernie Sanders' politics. At a recent conference of centrists with the comically vacuous name Welcome Fest, abundance was the hot book of the moment. It fits the agenda of Marie Gluesenkamp-Perez, the Blue Dog Democratic representative who loves to talk about how we've snarled the country up with red tape and is even willing to make up stories about non-existent bureaucratic absurdities involving bananas. See my current affairs article on her for more about that. It also fits the agenda of the right-leaning pundit Josh Barro, who's declared that abundance will require fighting labor unions.
When I look at policies in New York that stand in the way of abundance, very often, if you look under the hood, you eventually find a labor union at the end.
And the confidently wrong Matt Iglesias delights in the way abundance overlaps with his long-standing criticism of the groups.
These problems here are being caused by fairly mainstream groups that have real meaningful clout in the Democratic Party, major green organizations, labor unions, things like that.
And I've always suspected he says this phrase, the groups, in part because admitting that when you're talking about the groups, you're actually talking about the NAACP, Planned Parenthood, the ACLU, the Sunrise Movement. Well, that makes you sound awfully reactionary, so better not say who they are by name. So Ezra Klein might personally believe, as I think he does, in wealth redistribution and unions, but he's offered a great program for billionaires who don't want us to talk about the predations of the health insurance industry or big corporations crushing union drives. Let's talk about zoning reform instead. So one reason leftists have been critical of abundance is that it ends up ignoring some of the chief villains in the stories it tells. The book, the authors say, is an effort to focus more of American politics on a surprisingly neglected question. What do we need more of, and what is stopping us from getting it? Now, that's a good question, but then they say the book is largely a critique of how Democrats have governed in the places where they've held power. Now, that implies they believe a critique of how Democrats have governed is the proper answer to the question of what is stopping us from having more of what we need. And so that results in them telling a story of climate politics that focuses on the cases in which environmental groups have opposed solar plants without talking about the fossil fuel industry or the Republican Party. So Klein and Thompson say in the book they deliberately don't discuss the right. And they say that's because they don't think they're likely to persuade the right, and a critique of liberals is more valuable. They say, we focus in this book on the pathologies of the broad left. One reason for that is we don't see ourselves as effective messengers to the right. Okay, fine. But that means they're not actually answering their question, which is what is stopping us from having the things we want? Because an honest answer to that question is giant corporations that profit from the destruction of the planet, exorbitant healthcare costs, and a hobbled government. Now, Ezra Klein admits that dealing with climate change will require confronting the fossil fuel industry. He has said You cannot decarbonize the economy without running headlong into fossil fuel interests, but the industry's role is just left out of abundance's story of our times, which again purports to be a sweeping tale of how everything went wrong and why we didn't reach the utopia. In fact, they spend more pages criticizing Ralph Nader and the degrowth movement, which are both politically marginal, than they do explaining how corporate power stands in the way of, for example, a universal healthcare system. And so it's no wonder that abundance has received a chilly reception on the left. Sam Adler-Bell calls it myopic about power and flattering to those who have it. Malcolm Harris, while he conceded that abundance is hardly the worst thing for sale at the airport, that would probably be Jordan Peterson's We Who Wrestle with God, says that Klein and Thompson believe that if there appears to be a problem regarding scarce resources or conflicting values, we should just innovate our way out. And in the American Prospect, Hannah Story Brown says that by failing to recognize who has vested interest in our unequal economy, the authors don't seem to recognize that serving the public interest will require political leaders willing to make powerful enemies. And Sandeep Vaheesan in Boston Review says that abundance often blames government for bad outcomes, where it should be blaming the whole structure of the market, instead of calling for steeper progressive taxation and anti-monopoly policies that would rein in the power of the affluent. Klein and Thompson focus single-mindedly on red tape while embracing Silicon Valley's vision for America and the familiar futurism of the tech oligarchs. Now, all of those criticisms, I have to say, having read the book very closely, are pretty accurate. And I'd add to them that when Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson do bash leftists, as they do, they often do so quite unfairly. For instance, they are very negative towards degrowth, which is the movement that argues resource limitations mean we need to stop pursuing endless economic growth and start measuring the success of our societies by whether they meet human needs. But they don't hesitate to misrepresent degrowth's proponents. For instance, they say, quote, to the extent that degrowth has a specific climate plan, it is to shut off or scale down areas of production it deems destructive, like military investment, meat and dairy production, advertising, and fast fashion. But that's not true. The plan doesn't just involve shutting off destructive production. It also involves building renewable energy infrastructure. And leading degrowther Jason Hickel, whose work they do cite, has said, we absolutely need a Green New Deal to mobilize a rapid rollout of renewable energy and put an end to fossil fuels. And he's even written a full Green New Deal plan with some co-authors, which is compatible with degrowth principles. So to fairly criticize degrowthers, you must criticize their actual plans and not a selective cartoon of their plans. And likewise, in their segment, which attributes public sector sclerosis in part to the Nader's Raiders of the 70s, that was Ralph Nader's groups of lawyers and activists who held government and corporations accountable, Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson portray Ralph Nader as gleefully litigious, saying Nader didn't just criticize the government, he launched a movement to tame it. His raiders contributed to some of the most important environmental laws in history, but what they were building was an arm of liberalism designed to relentlessly sue the government itself, that would go on to fight for more bills and rules that would widen opportunities to sue the government. And when the PBS news anchor Jim Lehrer asked Nader in 2000 why he was qualified to be president, Nader told him, I don't know anyone who has sued more agencies and departments. Well, I looked up that interview, and in fact, that's not what Nader said when Lehrer asked him why he was qualified to be president. His full answer to that question was, well, I've been a full-time citizen for 40 years. I think the auto industry knows what I can do in terms of safer cars. We've tried to represent environmental and consumer interests. We're almost experts at how to make government and corporations accountable if they only give us a chance, and they'll all be better off as a result. I think also I have a talent in getting people to have a higher estimate of their own significance, whether they're civil servants, whether they're in the business community, whether they're labor, whether at universities. I think we're suppressing a lot of talent in this country by excessive concentration of power. Now, the quote that they cite about suing the government, that was actually in response to a later question in the interview, which was, as a practical matter, do you believe you have the experience and the background to run the vast bureaucracy, the vast agencies and bureaus and departments of the US government? And to that, Ralph Nader replied, well, I don't know anybody who studied more of them. I don't know anybody who has sued more of them. I don't know anybody who's gotten more plain envelopes for more civil servants. I don't know anybody who has participated for over 3 decades in the process. In fact, I think we've created some of the safety agencies like the Auto Safety Agency. The distortion that I'm identifying that Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson make in this book of Ralph Nader's words, that might seem small, but it's pretty important. Because Ralph Nader wasn't saying in this interview that he was qualified to be president because he sues the government. That would fit Klein and Thompson's story that Nader and his ilk during the 1970s saw suing the government as the best way to enact policy, and that they saw restraints on the state as being more important by expanding the capacity of the state. That's their whole big narrative. But Nader actually brought up suing the government because he was asked if he really understood the federal bureaucracy. And his point there was he had incredibly extensive knowledge of the federal bureaucracy, which he does, in part because of all of his interactions with it, including through lawsuits, as well as writing a lot of detailed studies of agency activities. Now, I actually asked Ralph Nader himself, who is extremely sharp still at 91, what he thought of Klein and Thompson's argument that his movement created some of the primary roadblocks keeping America from having nice things. And he replied,
"Shame on Ezra Klein. The problem with Ezra Klein is he never talks to people like us. He doesn't put people like us on the program. He doesn't know how to use phrases like corporate crime or corporate welfare. So let's address what he's saying. So we got a lot of good laws through in the early 70s and late 60s. They were laws to save lives. Basically, it was the government saying to corporations, you're not going to decide who's going to live or die anymore by your profit calculation. You're going to have to meet mandatory safety standards. What's so wrong about that? Instead, he hops on this obstruction by bureaucracy, and you can't get anything done in terms of projects because of all the permit complexities. Well, see, he doesn't go deep enough. The greatest obstructions often come from corporations demanding waivers. That's the result of all the corporate lobbying. He's ascribing too much power to the people instead of the corrupt politicians who are always responding to one special interest after another that has a stake in a particular project or a particular undertaking that we used to call public works. The problem with Ezra Klein is he doesn't focus on the corporate domination of our political economy, of our culture, of our children sufficiently. And he's lost his way.
Now, Ralph Nader's right there. Abundance does leave out the role of corporate lobbying. It's barely discussed. Klein admits that corporations and billionaires do have too much power, but his book on why we don't have a utopia essentially leaves them out of the story. Now, you should check out an article by Aaron Regenberg and David Sirota, who've actually gone through some of the specific instances in which Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson kind of blame bureaucracy and regulation rather than corporations for our problems, and they show that Klein and Thompson are misunderstanding the reasons why certain policy initiatives fail, because they're leaving out this big part of the story, which is the corporate sector and the right wing. Also, another thing they strangely leave out in their discussion, which is pretty important, is Roosevelt's New Deal. Now, one reason Abundance is easy to mistake for a neoliberal tract is that while Klein and Thompson want, they say, a government that builds, Ezra Klein praises Barack Obama and Bill Clinton, but they leave out the most obvious precedent for a building Democrat. That's FDR. If you believe in getting stuff done through the state, your prototype should be the New Deal. It's massive construction of dams, public parks, schools, bridges, airports. It's programs to put people to work on everything from planting trees to writing plays. Now, Ezra Klein has actually said he avoids getting into arguments over who gets to claim FDR because FDR was too capacious and self-contradictory and unique and in too specific a historical moment. But if your philosophy is that we need a liberalism that builds, why would you not spend time discussing the era of democratic governance that built huge parts of the country as we know it? Now, Representative Josh Harder, who is a centrist Democrat, says this book, Abundance, has given voice to a feeling people have had for a while, that it's just too hard to build things. And if that's all it's doing, if it's just giving voice to a feeling that it's too hard to build things, fine. It's too hard to build things. Important point. We must note this, and we must govern accordingly. But if abundance is making it's too hard to build things the centerpiece of the Democratic message, it is both morally contemptible and it will compound Democratic electoral failure. Now, I say morally contemptible because I don't believe we should sideline issues of trans rights, abortion access, immigrant justice, student debt, climate justice, or substitute the language of building stuff for the language of equality. I also think the centerpieces of a Democratic agenda should be universal health care, free childcare, paid family leave, minimum wages, sick leave, labor organizing, and a path to citizenship for unauthorized immigrants. I actually admire the campaign of Zoran Mamdani in New York City. Now, he's been laser focused on free transit, low-cost housing. And he actually accepts the Klein and Thompson view on the importance of good government. He was asked about abundance, and he did comment.
Bureaucracy, efficiency, waste. If you care about public goods, public service, these have to be your primary focuses, because any evidence of that inefficiency is then a justification for the elimination of the public sector.
But Mamdani's not building his platform around tackling waste. He's building it around tackling inequality through free public services and rent control. Abundance liberalism doesn't tackle the major injustices of the time, but I also don't think it's going to inspire people much. Now, nor, to his credit, does Ezra Klein, whose response to a poll which showed that populist messaging, which is you're being robbed by corporate criminals, does better than abundance messaging. Red tape is keeping us from building, except among Republicans who are very receptive to that. His response to that was he wouldn't advise politicians to emphasize the abundance message in their campaigns, and I could not agree more. We do need effective governance, efficiency, and public services that people actually have faith in. But a good model for that is FDR, whom Klein and Thompson are reluctant to discuss. What we do not need is to pivot our political conversation away from the most pressing outrages of our time and toward a billionaire-friendly focus on efficiency instead of justice. Thanks for watching. This video is a product of Current Affairs Magazine, the country's leading independent left print magazine based here in New Orleans, Louisiana. Go to currentaffairs.org to find out more about us, and currentaffairs.org/subscribe to subscribe to our absolutely gorgeous bi-monthly print edition. Get it in your mailbox. You can also subscribe to the Current Affairs News Briefing, the Current Affairs Podcast, or you can subscribe to our digital edition. Current Affairs is entirely reader-supported. We have no ads. We have no corporate backers. We depend on you. So please consider purchasing a subscription or making a donation to Current Affairs today. We are a 501c3 non-profit organization, and your donations are tax-deductible to the extent allowable by law. Thanks for listening. Thanks for watching.